To Touch the Sun by Enright. Prologue. Reg Jameson squinted one eye, checking the view through the night scope with the other. The scope was unnecessary. His vision was perfectly capable of picking up the smallest movement even on cloudy nights. But he liked to keep up with the latest in cool toy technology, and the scope had been recently acquired through the French arms dealer who he'd dealt with over the years. Many years. Based in Chantilly, the man must be pushing 75 at this point, yet remained on the cutting edge of weaponry. He was also very discreet, a trait Jameson prized above all else. Through the scope, Jameson picked up the silhouette of one of his ferals stepping carefully through the forest, senses alert for its prey. The feral's skin shone a ghastly white in the moonlight filtering through the trees, his features marred slightly by the prominent brow line and extreme dental anatomy particular to most ferals, but the hair that would have once been snarled and ratty, in a length dictated by the decades, was clean and short, his beard carefully groomed. The feral could pass in normal society provided no one stared too long, and with the energy ferals emanated, people rarely did. Two flanked him, and 18 others fanned out, their instincts the only thing required for the task. This was their world, and no matter how civilized Jameson succeeded in making them, the ferals would always be able to utilize the hunting instincts that had kept them alive long before he arrived. Reg sometimes marveled at the ferals. As powerful as he had grown over the decades, his abilities paled in comparison to theirs, and yet despite their strengths, their fractured minds had kept them from re-entering the societies they'd been torn from decades, sometimes centuries before. He should have used them first. It would have saved a great deal of time. Instead, he first sent a hunting party of trusted normal mercenaries to track down the creature, hoping that it would be weaker in the daylight. The encroaching shadows of night would not harm the mercenaries, but the daylight was toxic for Reg and his ferals. The creature, however, was powerful, even during the day, which was one of the things about it that initially caught Jameson's attention. A feral, christened Pierre with his real name lost to history, stopped and grunted softly, waving a hand low. The grunt, with the slightest of whistles, indicated to the others that they were close. Yes, Jameson could sense the beast himself. It gave off a very distinct presence. "This should be interesting," Jameson whispered. His normal hunting party had fared badly, and he'd had a devil of a time erasing their connection to him. They understood the risk to both their lives and reputation, which was why their fee was so high. The French police listed them as poachers, their sketchy backgrounds and the high-tech gear they sported backing up this profile. What authorities couldn't explain was what killed the group, breaking their bodies and draining them of blood and leaving them in a horrible heap on the side of the road. The grisly discovery was made by a young couple out for a hike who would no doubt carry the image with them for a long time. And that's what brought Jameson to the Amiens area of France. There had been talk of something terrorizing the woods. It started with an attack at a construction site for a new housing development. The gruesome deaths of a few of the workers, found drained of blood, had made international news, and Jameson caught sight of it one night on the BBC. Recognizing the area immediately, Jameson quickly speculated what could be terrorizing the area, soon realizing that it was something the authorities might never admit to be possible. What led Jameson to become a participant in the hunt, rather than remain a television spectator, what made the prey so important to him, was that the attacks had occurred during the day. Only a feral could attack with such efficiency that he could bring down 5 men, drain their blood, then disappear as it was reported something had done on the construction site without the rest of the crew being the wiser. But ferals were hampered by the weakness of all vampires, natural sunlight. The attack happened on a cloudy day, yet the light would still have been paralyzingly toxic. Somehow this feral had built up immunity to daylight. Who knew how old the creature was? It could be centuries old, buried deep in the ground until an urge, an instinct, something drove it up to the fresh air again. And if Jameson's suspicion was correct, the building going on in the area had disturbed it. Humans were encroaching on the territory of any number of species, so why should vampires be any different? Perhaps a bulldozer had unearthed it. If it had gone dormant, as many ferals did during the lean times, it would wake up very hungry and very determined, a bit like poking a hornet's nest. A mutated feral haunting the French countryside was not a good thing for France, but it could be very advantageous for Jameson. He dispatched the human hunters in the hopes that they would be able to capture the beast. That was a bust, and coming on the heels of the carnage at the construction site, it fueled more interest in the beast. This would complicate any attempt he might make to capture it, unless he was able to do so before a media frenzy began. This thing was more than likely feral, and sometimes fire was needed to fight fire. His expedition would require special arrangements, such as the specially designed mobile tombs for his hunters and himself to stay during the day, should the effort take more than one night, which ultimately it did. Jameson utilized every connection he had, both in government and the underworld, and was able to make arrangements which would enable them to make a thorough search of the area. He traveled to France regularly on business, but it had been almost a century since Jameson had last prowled that parcel of land. Of course, the landscape looked very different. Barren, mangled, chewed up by the war to end all wars, much like the soldiers struggling to stay alive during it. For a moment he fancied he could smell the acrid stench of the gunpowder that once had hung thick in the air. He could hear the screams of the young men falling around him, and feel the dirt and shrapnel bursting forth from craters made by the mortars pounding the ground. Then there was the horrible shredding of the German bullets that ripped into him, one in his shoulder, one in his side, another burrowing into the meat of his thigh, still another filling his chest with a fire he'd never felt before. He'd been brought to his knees with that agony before falling flat and still in the mud, where he slowly drifted away while the fight raged on around him. He'd been like so many, a wartime statistic, never standing a chance, destined to die for king and country. Except that his destiny lay in the hands of another. As his gaze wandered through the darkness of the forest and across the decades gone by, a grin spread across Jameson's face. He could still feel the slit of the blade across his throat before Private Narain Khan descended upon him and pulled the very life essence from him as they both lay dying in no man's land. Dying? No. Changing. Khan was no longer the man who had traveled so far to fight in a war that truly didn't concern his country. What had forced Khan to steal the blood of his dead and dying comrades that night had transformed both him and Jameson into something that neither could ever have imagined. The memories remained strong and clear through the decades, for Reg Jameson had never felt so alive as he did when he finally came to his senses and realized that the irony of this great gift being bestowed upon him by a greater adversary. He stifled a chuckle at the memories, not wanting to spoil the hunt. At last, in this, their fourth night, the hunters seemed to be making progress. Jameson checked his watch and noted that in 3 more hours they'd have to call it a night and return to the security of their well-constructed, windowless caravans driven by normal members of his staff who could answer any questions from passers-by during the day, while he and the ferals remained safe and secure inside. Just then the party caught sight of the beast they'd been sensing. Jameson stared agape at its size. It was a man with dark blonde hair and a beard long and matted from decades, possibly centuries, of being buried deep within the earth. While his clothes also bore the mark of 90-odd years above and below ground, Jameson could still note that he wore what appeared to be a British military uniform from World War I. Jameson was sure that it was a former soldier, perhaps even one of his own, though so many never made it home from that war that it would be hard to tell. "Well, Con, you were very hungry that night," he whispered with a grin. The being rested with his back against a tree, looking like a man lost in the woods, which for all intents and purposes he was. If he had been ripped from the dormancy, which would be the only thing explaining this sudden rash of killings, then he had to be confused. If he was a feral, his thoughts would go no further, for as a rule they did not think about much beyond obtaining their next meal. But what if he were sentient? Reg studied the man's face, which was partially obscured by matted locks of filthy hair. The look the man shot into the sky had a touch of melancholy as well as confusion. Pierre glanced back for the order, and Jameson nodded his head. Gracefully, silently, the ferals assumed a pack and made their way forward to surround their prey. But the man's hearing was apparently exceptional. Whether he heard the softest of grunts or the smallest crunch of leaves, something caught his attention. His head snapped in the direction of the noise for barely an instant before he was off, navigating the forest floor with the expert precision that only his condition could produce. The ferals sped after, and Jameson followed behind as close as he could. Sentient or feral, it was a beast, a huge, hulking frame, perhaps that of a former farmhand or blacksmith, Perhaps it was much older, and had simply borrowed the uniform from one of his victims. The grace he displayed despite his size, however, was amazing, as he dodged the fallen branches and the outstretched grasp of the ferals gaining on him. A few sped to the creature's left flank, and eventually the rest began to herd the beast toward them. What Reg didn't reckon on was just about how strong this man was. When the takedown came, it was not easy and did not last. In fact, the ferals had to attempt it twice before the beast stopped and stood his ground to fight. Ferals fought with little noise, one reason they were so unsettling. They dove in and out, grabbing, clawing, nipping at the man soundlessly, save for a few grunts or gasps. The man screamed unintelligible words at them, grabbing one and thumping it against a tree, while shoving another from its other side. They piled on him a few times, but he always was able to throw them off. "This contest could be an all-nighter," Jameson hissed. The creature had swatted some 20 ferals like gnats. A few of the ferals were grabbed and quickly dispatched, body parts thrown in all directions. No wonder the human hunters had never stood a chance. Reaching into the breast pocket of his hunting jacket, Jameson pulled out a small case that contained 2 darts. A tranquilizer that would stop an elephant wouldn't stop Jameson, not to mention this maniac. But Janning had assured him that the solution in these darts, experimental as it was, would stop a feral. He looked up at the battle going on, then back at the darts. This was not your average feral. Too little, and the beast might become even crazier. In the meantime, the ferals were being slaughtered. Loading 1 dart into his rifle, he took aim, hoping the beast would stand still long enough for a clear shot. Impatience gripping him, he called out, "Hey!" and took his shot when the startled combatants all looked up. The dart plunged into the being's right pectoral, releasing its drug before the beast had a chance to dislodge it. Undeterred and furious, the man grabbed a feral and twisted his head clean off its neck with a sickeningly wet sound, tossing it far into the woods behind him. Jameson grimaced, but noted that the creature seemed to be growing lethargic. There was still plenty of fight in him, though, so Jameson took aim with the last dart in the chamber. The dart pierced the being's left side, embedding itself firmly. Taking a few steps back, the being looked down and yanked it from its body. Deciding it was time to let the drug take its course, Jameson whistled off the feral attack and watched the remaining ferals back away while keeping the beast encircled. The huge being howled, falling to his knees and beating the ground in an effort to fight off the paralysis overcoming him. It was pointless. In a matter of moments, he was completely immobile, face down on the grass, the only sound being his furious hissing. Straightening from the crouch he'd been in, Jameson lowered his weapon and ran a hand through his brown hair. "Pierre," he began, before realizing that Pierre had been one of the casualties. Frowning, he turned to another feral, ordering, "Declan, get him back to the vehicles and pack him up for shipment. Do it quick, too." He glanced at his watch. "Not a lot of time, and I want him secure before sunrise. Oh," he studied the body parts strewn about the forest, "and bring back some accelerant." By the time Declan had returned with a container of petrol, Jameson had collected the gruesome remains and set them in a pile. Arms, legs, torsos, and heads twitched with a zombie-like life, and could have been pieced back together to create their original owners, but time was leaking away, and there'd be no time for such handiwork. Jameson couldn't allow them to be discovered, either. If evidence had to be found, let it be a charred lump to give the authorities yet another mystery to worry over. When the gruesome deed was done, he and Declan hurried back to the caravans to make arrangements to leave. A special lorry had been arranged to transport their prize, its reinforced structure able to contain the creature, even if it were to escape the specially designed restraints. Jameson had come prepared with more of the paralyzing drug, so he planned on keeping him as heavily sedated as possible. In the back of the lorry, arms and legs and abdomen clamped to a shelf, the beast still battled with the agent attacking his system. Or, if Jameson understood Channing correctly, the little creatures inside him did battle with the drug. The being's face was turned away from him when Jameson came in to check the restraints. Feeling the touch, the man summoned enough strength to turn toward him. It was then that the decades came rushing back to both of them. Eyes wide, Jameson mouthed, "Private Fred Blythe." Under all that hair, he hadn't recognized him, and the Blythe he'd known during the Great War was nowhere near the size of this giant. There had definitely been some sort of mutated effect over the years, but the eyes told it all. This was Blythe, and his pale blue eyes still blazed with hatred as they gazed up at the man who had tormented him in the trenches another lifetime ago. Rubbing the back of his hand against his chin, Reg said, "So, old chap, you made it out too, eh? Been a long time." A snarl formed on the creature's face. "Tut, tut, none of that. I'm here to help you." He checked the restraints again. "Provided, of course, you're able to help me."